The cold is different when you're waiting for a man to die. It isn't the temperature of the air. It's the way the heat leaves your own skin, retreating inward to protect a heart that is beating too fast. Pablo is standing in the doorway of a warehouse that smells of wet earth and ancient rotting wood. His breath is a thin gray ghost in front of his face. He's 19 years old. In his pocket, his hand is closed around a heavy brass key, not to a door, but to a crate. Inside that crate is a lie so perfect that it has already cost a man his reputation, and within the next 60 seconds, it will cost him his life. Pablo isn't holding a weapon. He doesn't need to. He is watching the headlights of a black sedan cut through the mist of the Medellín Valley, crawling up the dirt track like a predator scenting blood. The engine cut. The silence that followed was heavier than the noise. He could hear the metal of the car cooling, a rhythmic ticking that sounded like a countdown. He looked at his watch. 3 in the morning, the time of day when the world is either asleep or dying. He felt a sudden sharp urge to turn and run into the trees, to go back to being the boy who sold stolen tombstones, the boy who just wanted to help his mother. But he stayed. He watched the car door open. He watched the man step out, a man who thought he was meeting a business partner, a man who thought he was in control. Pablo realized then that the most dangerous person in the world isn't the one with the gun. It's the one who controls what you believe is true. He didn't move. He didn't blink. He just waited for the scream he knew was coming. And in that moment, the boy he used to be simply ceased to exist.
If you're drawn to the untold stories of power, betrayal, and men who ruled through fear rather than noise, you're in the right place. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. The history they teach you is a map of shadows. They tell you about the kings, the presidents, and the generals, but they never tell you about the architects of the invisible. Most people believe that power is something you take with a fist. They are wrong. Real power is grown in the dark, nurtured by the secrets that men are too afraid to say out loud. Records were buried. Witnesses were erased. The truth of how a street kid from Envigado dismantled the soul of a nation was rewritten to look like a simple story of greed. But it wasn't about money. It was about the terrifying discovery that reality is negotiable. This story will permanently change how you understand power, loyalty, fear, and control. It will show you that the greatest empires aren't built on gold, but on the terrifying architecture of a single man's mind. Long before the world knew his name, there was the pressure. It's a weight that never leaves you when you grow up seeing the ceiling of your own life. Pablo lived in a world of small rooms and loud debts. He watched his father work the land, a man of honor who died with nothing but dirt under his fingernails. He watched his mother, a teacher, try to instill values in children who were already hungry for things she couldn't explain. The moral conflict wasn't a choice, it was a slow erosion. He didn't wake up one day and decide to be a monster. He woke up and realized that being good was just another way of staying poor. He started to feel a profound isolation, a sense that he was the only one who saw the strings moving the puppets. He saw the wealthy elite in their white suits, and he didn't see success. He saw a target. He saw a fraud. He began to move through the city like a ghost. He didn't talk much. He listened. He listened to the way the police spoke to the shopkeepers. He listened to the way the students at the university talked about their futures as if they were guaranteed. He started his first business in the graveyard. It was a quiet, respectful trade.
He would steal the tombstones of the wealthy, sand down the names, and sell them back to the grieving families of the poor. It was his first lesson in the fluidity of identity. A name could be erased, a legacy could be swapped. He realized that if people couldn't protect the names of their dead, they certainly couldn't protect the truth of their living. What Pablo didn't know was that the graveyard was only the beginning. He moved from stone to paper. He found a man in a basement who could mimic the seal of the National University. Suddenly, Pablo wasn't just a street kid, he was a distributor of status. He sold diplomas to men who had the knowledge but lacked the pedigree. He watched them hang those forged papers on their walls, watched them beam with a pride that was founded on a lie he had manufactured. He began to see that everyone was wearing a mask. The judge, the priest, the colonel, they all had a secret they were protecting. This was the moment everything began to crack. He stopped looking at people as neighbors and started looking at them as files. If you knew what a man wanted, you owned him. If you knew what a man feared, you were his god. But power, even in its infancy, creates a vacuum. The more Pablo provided the means for others to lie, the more he had to lie to himself. He became a master of the nervous silence. When he entered a room, the air seemed to thin out. It wasn't because of his size or his voice. It was because no one knew what he knew. He was a teenager with the eyes of an old man, eyes that seemed to be looking through your skin at the ledger of your sins. He began to deal in rare items, pottery and artifacts that he claimed were thousands of years old. He would take common clay, bake it in a custom oven, and bury it in the acidic soil of the valley for 3 months. When he dug it up, it looked like history. He sold these pieces to collectors from the United States and Europe. He watched them touch the ancient markings with reverence. He felt a cold, distant amusement. He was selling them the past because he knew they were too afraid to face the future.
Every decision he made quietly sealed his fate. He was moving closer to the center of a web he didn't yet realize was his own prison. The stakes grew higher. It wasn't about a few hundred pesos anymore. It was about the realization that he could manipulate the very fabric of society. He began to recruit, not soldiers, not yet. He recruited the desperate. He looked for the man with the sick daughter, the student with the gambling debt, the clerk with the unfaithful wife. He didn't offer them money. He offered them a solution, and in exchange he took their loyalty. It was a slow, agonizing build. He was waiting for the world to notice him, and at the same time he was terrified of what would happen when it did. He started to sleep with his eyes open. He imagined he could hear the thoughts of the people in the next room. Paranoia is the shadow of power, and as his power grew, the shadow lengthened until it touched everything he loved. He would sit for hours in the dark listening to the radio static, convinced there was a code hidden in the noise. He was waiting for a betrayal he knew was inevitable. He looked at his closest associates and wondered which one of them would be the first to sell him out. He didn't realize that by expecting betrayal, he was creating the conditions for it. He was becoming a man who lived in the future, always calculating the next move, while the present moment slipped through his fingers like sand. The payoff was coming, but he delayed it. He wanted to feel the tension until it was a physical pain. He had a meeting set with a high-ranking official who had been investigating the diploma mill. Pablo knew the man couldn't be bought with money. He was too proud for that. So Pablo didn't bring money. He brought a photograph. It was a simple picture of the official's son entering a house he shouldn't have been in. Pablo sat across from the man in a quiet cafe. He didn't speak. He just pushed the envelope across the table.
He watched the man's face turn the color of ash. He watched the man's hands shake as he tucked the envelope into his coat. There was no argument. There was no negotiation. There was only the sound of the official's heavy, ragged breathing. Pablo took a sip of his coffee. It was cold.
The twist was quiet. There were no sirens, no gunfights. The investigation simply vanished. The official became one of Pablo's strongest advocates. It was a psychological victory that was more addictive than any drug. Pablo realized that he didn't need to break the law. He just needed to be the one who decided what the law was. He was no longer a criminal. He was a force of nature. Word began to spread, not as news, but as a whisper. People started to speak of a young man in Medellín who could make problems disappear. They didn't use his name. They just called him the one who knows. Allies began to align themselves with him out of fear, and enemies began to adjust their plans, realizing that the old rules no longer applied. The legend was born in the silence. It grew in the gaps between what was said and what was done. Pablo Escobar had turned a teenager's hustle into a blueprint for an empire. He had learned that the world isn't run by the strongest or the smartest, but by the one who is the most patient. He had learned to wait. He had learned to watch. And most importantly, he had learned that everyone has a price, and if you can't pay it in gold, you can always pay it in lead. As he stood on that balcony years later, looking over the empire he had built on a foundation of fake diplomas and stolen stones, he realized the ultimate truth. Power doesn't change you. It just strips away the distractions until you are forced to see who you really were all along. He was still that boy in the warehouse, waiting in the dark, listening for a car that would eventually come for him. He had everything, and yet he had nothing. He had conquered the world, but he had lost the ability to trust the ground beneath his feet. Fear is a jealous master. It demands everything, and it gives back only the hollow echo of your own name. The final line of the ledger is always written in red, not because of the blood, but because of the debt. A life built on the manipulation of truth is a debt that can never be repaid. It is a weight that grows with every victory, a silence that gets louder with every shout. Pablo Escobar didn't fall because of the police, or the Americans, or the rival cartels. He fell because he finally ran out of lies to tell himself. He was the architect of a world that didn't exist, and eventually the walls of that world simply gave way. This is Escobar History Files. Subscribe for the stories history tried to bury.